This review is a version 1.0. Hopefully on launch day we're going to get a patch that's going to improve things. Do keep your eye on the top comment. Reynatis is developed by Natsume Atari, with some notable names on its credits, like Yoko Shimomura, most known for her work on the Kingdom Hearts series, and with a storyline that was partly penned by Kazushige Nojima, one of the writers for the Final Fantasy series. This is also releasing on the Nintendo Switch. Yes, it's available on other platforms, but we're looking specifically at the Nintendo Switch version, the frame rates, performance, and whether or not the Switch is a good place to play it. Is Reynatis a magical experience, or will it leave you in a fury? Well, my name's Mark Walker. Welcome back to SwitchUp. Now let's find out. Now I'm really keen that reviews are of the most use to all of you, so I'm actually going to listen to a bit of feedback from a previous video where you suggested why don't we look at performance and visuals first in some of these reviews, specifically where it's an important factor. So let's try it out. Reynatis then targets 30 frames per second on the Nintendo Switch, and in the larger areas, unfortunately, it cannot maintain that. It will dip down into the 20s, 22, and as you can see from the footage on screen, the frame pacing is sadly all over the place here. Now for many games that would be it, game over, the death knell, but Reynatis has a number of different areas. In fact, it's spread out over the entire city of Shibuya, as well as an alternate reality set within this forest, and those areas actually perform much better. They're able to hit 30 frames per second much more frequently, but I did encounter a couple of strange bugs as well. One of those relates to the camera mode, which allows you obviously to take photographs. I was able to basically break the game where I could still hear my character, but the camera mode was stuck on a white screen and I had to shut the game down and reload. That is something they're going to have to fix, so right now just avoid using the camera functionality. And visually, Reynatis is actually a lovely looking game in many aspects. It's a custom engine from Natsume Atari, and they're actually able to get some good quality from a lot of the scenes. Character models from a distance can look quite nice. There are effects which affect their clothing, giving them a wavy look as they move around, and that certainly suits the fluid combat, but their faces and expressions are a little lifeless. And their eyes, which are tied to the magic in the game, as we'll go into, look, well, they look a bit janky, don't they? NPCs mill around, very Persona-like, and you can pass through them as you move, and it's a world where you will see many clones. I think the biggest issue for most people on the Switch will be those performance dips, particularly when you're in a larger area that requires combat. Low transitions are actually surprisingly good, there weren't any issues here, and that's good because you can fast travel anywhere you've been to previously. Rather than go with full-on pop-in, scenery items will fade transition using a crosshatch technique that at least gets rid of some of the jarring awkwardness that you get when scenery just explodes into view. There's a middling amount of enemy variety, various different monsters and bosses, but as you're facing off against the MEA units a lot of the time, you kind of expect them to look the same. Thankfully, the actual characters you play as have a good variety between them, so they at least get a pass on that front. The soundtrack, which, as I mentioned at the start, was created by Yoko Shimomura, does so much to carry the storytelling. There are often times where the music will shift based on what's on screen. That might sound really obvious, but very often RPGs just completely ignore that. Yes, I am looking at you, Dragon Quest XI's, so it's nice to see that she's really put a lot of effort into this one. Sound effects are pretty generic, but the voice work, although only available in Japanese sadly, is surprisingly good, with a few standout performances. As is so often the case on Switch, visuals and performance are what let it down. They're sitting at around 13 out of 20, and while sound and audio are pretty great across the board, I would have loved an English dub. I'm not too much of a purist, and when there's text on screen and I'm having to run around and still read it, I always long for that option. Sound and audio scores 16 out of 20. So let's go on to story and gameplay then. It's actually the storyline that most surprised me. I find it really difficult to get into RPG stories these days. They seem so often generic, repeating the same old tropes. And look, I'm not going to say you won't see some of those here, but the premise was just surprisingly easy to get on board with. You've got a split protagonist system, and they're working for polar opposite teams. On the one hand, you've got the MEA, that's the Magical Enforcement Administration. They are essentially magic users and wizards who have been brought on to take down other magic users and wizards. Just that premise alone sets up a lot of comparisons and similarities for some of the real-world atrocities we've seen throughout the centuries. Throw in the fact that both sides of the equation here feel like they're doing the right thing and for sure have motivations which are understandable. It's a nice narrative setup. Now in this world, as I've alluded to, the use of magic publicly is basically banned. However, there's a drug called rubrum, which once consumed gradually allows the user to experiment and have magic abilities, but unfortunately it gradually corrupts them through its addictive nature, turning them into monsters. You'll meet many characters through main and side quests who use rubrum, and a lot of the time their reasoning can't be flawed. I like the way it dealt with grey areas. So then the MEA side of the story centers around Nishijima, as she and her team set out to eradicate that drug from the system. And on the flip side, you've got Marin, who wants to become the strongest wizard. His sole goal is to fight back against the MEA and others who would oppress those who have magical abilities. And to that end, he ends up joining a local guild. Guilds are groups of magical users who are outside of the law and trying to do exactly that. One particular guild are known as the Owls, who Marin joins up with early on. There's a dual narrative that focuses around the origins of magic that was what really hooked me in. There are these rifts in space-time known as the fog, and Marin gradually explores their use, examining how users first got their magical abilities through near-death experiences. Now believe it or not, I've actually told you nothing of the storyline. This really is the tip of the iceberg, the very first half hour in terms of narrative delivery, so rest assured there is enough for you to sink your teeth into. The gameplay feels like a number of other titles mashed into one. The combat features 3 different characters, controllable and switchable, and an interesting real-time system that essentially amounts to parrying at just the right moment. Holding the button down to fill a bar and then releasing will allow you to dodge the enemy attack and refill what's known as the MP bar, which you can see here. And here's the kicker. That bar is constantly draining. Because your character requires energy to use magic, everyone will either be in suppression mode, where they look like everyone else walking around on the street, or they're in liberation mode where their abilities are unleashed, their eyes light up, and their outfits change, and then they're draining that magical ability but able to use all of their skills, with those shown over here and acting on a cooldown but also consuming some of that MP. It's a nice balanced system because when it hits 0, you automatically switch back to your mortal form, and you'll have to wait for that to charge up or focus on those parry counter moves. You'll also be charging up a little bar underneath your MP, which when maxed out allows you to perform what's known as an astral surge. You won't be adding any new weapons to your characters, you'll simply be switching between them, but I did find the variety not the best. You've got one ranged, a couple of swords and something like a hammer. Oh, and that one guy who thinks he can punch everything to death. I think some might find that roster a little limited in scope. Now the camera work here is a little bit iffy. While you can click and lock on to enemies, the way that the camera positions itself can be unhelpful. To that end, I ended up setting the sensitivity to maximum and manually controlling the camera a lot of the time, which isn't ideal in a game this fast paced. Combat does have a surprisingly good flow to it though, especially when you get to grips with those parry mechanics. Throw in the fact that you can quickly switch to our team members, and there's that Capcom beat 'em up tag moment where they might do a move while you're there, and the general speed of combat, it lends itself to feeling quite exciting. But excitement doesn't mean depth. If you're looking for that, Reynatis isn't the place for it. While I really like the parry system, I do feel like its window is a little bit flawed. You almost have to wait till you've been struck, and if you don't time it exactly right, you'll just see a red circle. If you press the button quickly, you can dodge out of any damage. I do think there's more visually they could have done to let the player know when that window is. Certainly there are periods where you fight a new enemy where it's just hit and miss. Around the city, depending on who you're playing as, you may be battling monsters or members of the MEA, and there are no random encounters or anything like that, and you can run away if you're in trouble. The liberation and suppression system also applies outside of combat, where if you're showing that you have magic skills, people in the town will start to take pictures of you. They're essentially reporting you to the MEA, and eventually they'll show up and put an end to you. The city of Shibuya is quite a large place. Everywhere you visited, you can instantly fast travel back to that location. While I didn't mind moving around the city, there's nothing particularly too interesting to go and explore. That's probably one of the weakest aspects of the game in general. And aside from main quests, you've got side quests available through your smart device, and they'll affect the overall rating that you have in that area. It's almost like you're standing with the populace, how much they like or dislike you. And the importance of that is it allows you to access different wizards. These are graffitis which allow you to draw power from them and gain new abilities. You find them dotted around the world, and sometimes you're just not at the right level to be able to access them. So it's through the carrying out of side missions and content that you actually augment your characters. They do level up in combat as well. And you can also improve the ranking of certain abilities, putting points into them to power them up, with I believe 2 active skills selectable and 5 passive. Action RPG fans, I think you might have a surprisingly good time with Reynatis. Things like the combat system, which I just wasn't sure of to start with, they really grow on you, but a lack of variety in terms of customization, you kinda have to deal with that. The magic arts, they're cool, with obvious influences. It's no coincidence that we have actual Neo The World Ends With You quest lines in here. If you value story and narrative as the top priority in a JRPG, then you're going to really enjoy this, but it lacks the depth and variety that some of its inspirations had. Still enjoyable, gameplay gets 15 out of 20, while I would give the controls 14 out of 20. Now on Nintendo Switch, we're looking at £53.99, which is unacceptable for the condition the game's launching in, I have to say. Performance just does not match that asking price at all. Personally, if I was gonna pick up the game, I'd be looking at the physical edition, which actually here in the UK, I believe on Amazon, has a 25% discount, taking it down to £39.99. But obviously value takes a big hit when it can't hit 30 frames per second in a lot of areas, and there are other bugs. Version 1.0 at launch though, gets a value score of 13 out of 20. I personally really enjoyed Reynatis despite its flaws. The storyline kept me engaged, the combat was simplistic, but it was also quite enjoyable. But for many, the world will just be a little too devoid of life, and the systems a bit too simple for their liking. And of course, it really needs a performance patch on Switch. Right now, it gets a SwitchUp score of 71%. Thanks to our Patreons, our members, all of you that enjoy the content that we make. Tickle buttons, leave comments, and I'll try and reply to as many as I can. For all things Switch, all the time, keep it Switch up. Cheers guys, see ya!